In this video we are going to show you that the Qur'an cannot have been revealed by God because it contains stories that existed long before Muhammad was born. Now, it doesn't always mean that a story isn't true because it already existed, but when these stories clearly come from uninspired myths and fictitious traditions that also circulated among the people Muhammad had frequent contact with, we can say that it involves copying and adapting stories heard from those who previously disbelieved. Various Qur'an stories, such as God who raises a mountain above the Jews, or Jesus who made birds out of clay, already existed and can be read today in pre-Islamic scriptures that also contain all kinds of reasons why it cannot be authentic. For example, some stories come straight from the Jewish Talmud that Muhammad seems to confuse with the Torah, which was sent to Moses. Other stories come from Gnostic writings about Jesus that cannot be historically reliable works due to their most late dating and high salinity of geography. There are also writings that have never been unanimously recognized by the Church. You will now see a table of contents of this video on the screen, and you can also choose to scroll to the topic you are most curious about. Muhammad was repeatedly accused by his contemporaries of presenting existing stories as if they were unique revelations from God. No doubt these people did this because they recognized what Muhammad was telling them. The Qur'an itself also speaks about this in Surah 25 verse 5. We can prove in advance that Muhammad had frequent contact with the people and he was able to take all these stories from them. The Qur'an makes very clear reference to such conversations between the Muslims, Jews, and the Christians in their environment. We see this, for example, in Surah 2, verse 135, and Surah 2, verse 139. The argument that Muhammad encountered few or no Christians and Jews in his life is quickly refuted. You will read this further in point 1.3 and 1.5, that there is much more evidence for this. When we quote the Qur'an commentary of the world-famous scholar Ibn Kathir regarding this passage, we read that he refers to this narration in Sahih al-Bukhari, which shows clearly that the Jews did their best to explain their writings in Arabic to the Muslims. We also know from various Islamic sources that Muhammad heard biblical stories such as Jesus who made birds out of clay directly from the Christians around him, and then some of these stories are now in the Qur'an. So, who did Muhammad first hear these stories from? Did he hear it from Allah or the Christians he spoke to? Take your time and study the text on the screen from 2 Arabic biographies about the life of Muhammad. It should be clear that Muhammad and his companions had every opportunity to hear the most diverse stories of Jews and Christians. But was this all real revelation? And what did Muhammad do with those stories? It was not uncommon for Muhammad to hear stories from the Jews and later proclaim them as revelation. This becomes clear when we look at the sayings of Aisha in Sahih Muslim. In this, according to the Muslims, an authentic hadith, we read clearly that Muhammad heard stories from a Jewish woman that seems to come directly from her faith. And then Muhammad presents this concept as something that would have been revealed to him, but of course we don't fall for that. Apart from the fact that this is of course a very suspicious state of affairs, there's even more that stands out when we study history. Indeed, the idea that there would be pain in the grave already existed among the Jews, but this is not from the Torah, this is from the Talmud. That's a book written by Jewish scholars that cannot be called revelation by Muslims or Christians. You can now see the Babylonian Talmud in which the rabbis already speak about the pains of the grave, which was later also developed further in Jewish circles, but it already has its origin before Islam. When we consult historian Leor Halevi's acclaimed work on early Islamic society, we read that he indicates that both the Jewish and Islamic traditions have a concept that can be taught as the torments of the grave. He points out that a number of Jewish rabbis refer to such a concept in the Talmud as early as pre-Islamic times. He therefore suggests that the Muslims must have taken this concept from the Jews and then transformed it. And that theory is supported by the Sahih Muslim tradition that we just portrayed, because the Hadith itself describes exactly how Muhammad first heard these stories from a Jewish woman and then presented it as revelation. So Muhammad undoubtedly has in all those conversations with Jews he heard stories that are very important to the Jews, but in reality they come from the Talmud. Logically, Muhammad must have thought, because of the enthusiasm of the Jews, that these were revealed stories. But the foregoing proofs make very clear that Muhammad could not distinguish between real revelation and man-made stories. We have demonstrated a number of things so far. First of all, we have seen that according to many Islamic sources, Muhammad had extensive contact with the Jews and Christians. In addition, we have seen that Aisha states that a certain story that Muhammad heard from a Jewish woman was afterwards revealed to him quite by accident. Then we can now come to some examples of the pre-Islamic era that ended up in the Qur'an. We would like to point out that this is just a sampling of a whole range of evidence. Immediately after the story of Abel's murder follows a verse in the Qur'an which seems to have little to do with the foregoing. However, you will see that link becomes clear when we find out from where the writer of the Qur'an, Surah 5 verse 32, has plagiarized from. This is perhaps the most quoted Qur'an verse in efforts to make the Qur'an appear peaceful and non-violent. Turning to the Babylonian Talmud, it is immediately clear that the similarities are undeniable. Almost word for word is the most quoted part of Surah 5 verse 32 in the Babylonian Talmud, which was written long before Muhammad. A beautiful verse that of course widely circulated orally among the Jews whom Muhammad knew. It is somewhat understandable that Muhammad would have liked to include this verse in the Qur'an. Although it's of course a pity that he has adapted the verse on the assumption that he had to align it with the legislation found in the rest of the Qur'an. Anyway, this verse is not a statement from Allah, but comes straight from the pen of a Jewish rabbi, who could not have written later than 500 AD, which is about a century before the coming of Muhammad. Now the Qur'an does state that it was revealed to the Jews, but the Talmud is not revelation. Moreover, the reason for the so-called revelation according to the Qur'an, the event around Cain and Abel, and that's thousands of years before the rabbi wrote this verse. It therefore seems that Muhammad thought that this came from the Torah, a confusion that many people still play tricks today. In several Quranic passages, Jesus appears as a baby who can speak. We also find this story long before the time of Muhammad. Not in the Bible, but in pre-Islamic Gnostic writings. For example, in Surah 19, verse 29 and 30. This story can be found almost word for word in the work called the Arabic Gospel of the Childhood of the Savior. This is an uninspired work, which means it's not inspired by God. Christians call such works apocryphal. This writing also dates from the 5th and 6th centuries AD, which is too late to be reliable. But it was written well before Muhammad's birth, so he could easily hear these stories from the Christians, wrongly perpetuated this tradition afterwards. In Surahs 3 and 5, we then find the story of Jesus creating birds out of clay. This also comes from the source we just mentioned, namely the 5th century Arabic infancy gospel. But it also comes from a second, much earlier source, namely the infancy gospel of Thomas, written around the end of the 2nd century. Although this is an older work, it may not be authentic for the aforementioned reasons. There's something remarkable about this example of Jesus in the Qur'an, for there it can be shown from Islamic sources that Muhammad learned exactly this story firsthand from Christians with whom he spoke. Thus it is proved that he heard this from Christians, and then it suddenly appeared as a so-called revelation, and was added to the Qur'an that we know today. It is therefore not surprising that his contemporaries said that he was simply rehashing stories from the past. We have already shown the biography of Muhammad, in which we see that the Prophet of Islam heard these and other things from the Christians at the beginning of this video under 1.4. But for the sake of care, you see this again on the screen. In Surah 7, verse 171, we read how Allah remembers the time when He set a mountain above the children of Israel, who ascended it, as if it were a dome or a cumulus cloud. We read that the Jews thought it would fall on them. Then Allah warns that they must hold firmly to what has been given to them and what is written in their scriptures. This exact story also existed for a long time in a slightly different form and can be found in the Talmud discussed earlier, a pre-Islamic Jewish work not revealed by God and written by rabbis over the centuries. You have to realize also here that this does not come from the Torah itself, but is written as a commentary on the Torah. So in fact, here we are reading the Jewish tafsir, or the Torah commentary that Muhammad mistook for revelation. We have now been able to demonstrate a number of stories of plagiarism in the Qur'an. These examples are just a sampling of a whole list of stories that historians know exactly where they come from. The observant student of knowledge will therefore conclude that these Quranic passages were not revealed by God to Muhammad, but in centuries that followed arose from human fabrications. In addition to these stories, there are multiple examples of literature which have been written by Greek scientists and afterwards plagiarized by the author or the authors of the Qur'an. Consider, for example, the much outdated science about the embryo. Muslim apologists continuously try to prove that this still corresponds with the current knowledge about the biological process. With God's will, we will make a video about this too in the future and show you how the embryology in the Quran, how it's described, it's all completely wrong. And finally, we hope and pray that this video will give our Christian brothers and sisters the opportunity to respond to Muslims when they attack the Bible or glorify the Quran. For though our faith is a matter of the soul and therefore needs no defense, it remains important not to neglect our rational side, all the more so because it gives critics the chance to hear the truth in a way that makes short work of their own claims. Share this video for that reason as much as possible with your friends and acquaintances. Thanks for watching, and God bless.